Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is Monday, and I believe it is the 28th of July. I have a calendar right here, and I'm right on. It's the 28th of July, and it is a pleasure to be with you after an hiatus of 5 days. If you remember, our last program took place on Wednesday last. So as I mentioned, every Monday, I always get a little bit nervous when I'm off for 4 or 5 days. And I mentioned that to Bob before we went on the air, and he said, once that music starts and once you get cranking, you'll be fine. And maybe I will. I hope so. Anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you after so long a time. I want to invite you to participate with us in our program so that not only I, but more important, our listeners can be the beneficiaries of your thought, your ideas, your considerations, your questions, your opinions, whatever they might be. I didn't want you to think I was being facetious, because I was going to say your wisdom, and I mean that. If in terms of effective dialogue, that's what it is. Each side brings something materially important to a dialogue that has meaning. We'll talk about that in a second. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. Again, that's 304-574-8178. If you'd like to communicate with me directly via email, I would love to hear from you. I received 4 or 5 very, very solid emails during the last 3 or 4 days from listeners. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. I think at one point in time, several months ago, I mentioned where the 906 came from. That was my dad's favorite number. My dad used to engage in some off-track betting, if you will. When I was a kid, we were growing up in Boston, and his favorite number always was 906. And so when I had to select an email address, and they said it has to be a combination of letters and numbers, I thought, well, there's no number that I'll remember easier than 906. So anyway, that's where it came from, and feel free to use it. In fact, got a couple of wonderful emails over the weekend, 2 of them from Jack in Shreveport, and 2 of them from Gene. Just received the most recent one from Gene just a few minutes before we went on the air, and it was a link to an article in Salon, which I really haven't had a chance to look at yet, but I will between now and tomorrow. I mentioned right at the outset of the program today about the nature of meaningful dialogue. For those of you who were with us last Wednesday in our last session together here at the Virtual Center, along with me, you were privileged, I believe, to experience a phone call from Taiwan by Horst. And for better than an hour, and I lost track of how much time it actually was. It's probably closer to 1 hour and 15 minutes or so. He and I engaged in a dialogue which I found absolutely exhilarating, and I mentioned it to Bob after the program, Bob Kincaid, and it's I haven't had an exchange like that since I was in graduate school. I still dream about those. I never really thought that I would experience them again. But last Wednesday's program turned out to be just that. It was, for me, absolutely exhilarating. I hope, and this is my real hope, that it was for the listening audience as well. I believed at the end, after it was over, I really believed that you could almost use an excerpt of that conversation as a case study in what a rich, meaningful dialogue ought to be about. For those of you who were with us, first of all, let me say that if you missed that program, and the effective date is July 23rd, then I encourage you to go to archives and experience it. You can go to whiterosesociety.org and just click on the program for July 23rd, 2014. Or, and this is something that Horst has done for all of us, I believe, you can go to YouTube, youtube.com, and if you click either my name, Bill O'Brien, or the Virtual Center, you will pick up a number of, you will pick up a whole list of our previous programs, our archived programs, with short 1 or 2 line statements as to what the theme of the program is about. And for that we have Horst to thank. And last Thursday, like clockwork, he posted the conversation we had on the 23rd on YouTube for all of us to experience again and hopefully to enjoy. I did listen to the program a second time because I found the exchange so meaningful. And while at the beginning we exchanged a number of pleasantries, mainly about the time change and about the whole idea of talking to somebody in real time on the other side of the world. I mean, it still amazes me. The bulk of the program focused on the reason for Horst's call, which was based on some questions that he had about John Locke, and specifically about John Locke's state of nature. And once we got into that, we had an exchange which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I kind of think he did as well. I just hope that his questions were answered. To be very honest with you, the conversation was taking place on a level that made it a little bit unclear as to whether in fact we were really addressing the substance of questions at all, because it dealt with the whole idea of rights and property and trying to get our hands around, our arms around, if you will, the meaning of theory, and that by definition is very, very difficult. It's almost like trying to contain Jell-O, if that makes sense, because you're talking by definition in abstractions anyway. But the fact of the matter is we live in a real world. And we live in a world where people have chosen to take portions of these particular abstractions and translate them into real world truths. And to be very honest with you, some people take the same abstraction and come up with 2 different meanings as to what the real world meaning of that happens to be. And a lot of times it depends more than anything else on one's particular agenda. In other words, we find what we set out to find in these things. This was basically the gist of the conversation, and we went back and forth, I'll bet 45 minutes on John Locke, and I thought it was just an incredible experience. I hope you will as well. But again, there are different levels on which you can experience a conversation like this. 2 of the major ones, first of all, is the content itself. I think the substance of the conversation, what it was about, and what we might all be able to learn as a result of the questions asked and the speculative answers to those questions introduced. I think it's valuable for the substance of the conversation itself, for the content. But as I mentioned at the outset, I think as an example of how dialogue can work and how a conversation like this, which kind of each side goes back and forth based on what the other one said, and you find that the conversation will take you into issues that were not even contemplated at the beginning of the conversation. In other words, the substance and the content of the conversation itself takes you into realms of investigation and speculation that are extremely informative and extremely insightful. This is what meaningful conversation does. That's why this kind of a program, that's why a program like those that regularly appear on the Head On Radio Network are so important, because the intent of them is not to answer questions. The intent of them is not to lay down truth. More important than that, the intent of programs like this is not to argue for or support a particular political or ideological agenda. The real purpose is to generate, is to provide the kind of information and content that generates an exchange similar to what happened last Wednesday between myself and Horst, in hopes that that conversation, when it takes off, will take everybody who's tuned into it into areas of speculation and possibly new insights that were never dreamed of at the very beginning. It's what learning is about. It's why learning is so exciting. It's an experience that every one of us ought to have at least once, hopefully more than once. And I think there are some of you out there that if you think for yourself, back and reflect for a moment, you'll probably recognize that in the course of your life, you've had those experiences a few times. Not nearly as much as any of us would like, but often enough to realize how important they are and how valuable it is that they happen. I know in my case, and I'm kind of guessing in the case of a number of you listening, we try to find ways to put ourselves into situations that will generate that kind of unexpected intellectual excitement. And that's exactly what it is. That's what I envision that we will have more and more of here at the Virtual Center. It doesn't necessarily require a whole lot of background and content, because what happened is that those engaged in the dialogue, in the conversation, will feed off the information being provided by the others engaged in it. but the depth of the questions that kind of a discussion can generate is as important, if not more important, than the content that any of us bring to the table. Because while some of us have a background in one area as opposed to another, Horst's, for example, his strength obviously is in engineering. And what I know about engineering, we could, I could put on the back of a postage stamp and mail it to you. But the fact of the matter is, once you are engaged in an exchange like this, the content provided by one side stimulates the kinds of insightful, incisive questions on the other, or reactions. And chances are a reaction to a particular point will produce a counter-reaction. And the essence of the dialogue is the process of reaction and counter-reaction that ends up informing both sides. Both sides leave the conversation knowing more than they did when they went into it. It's a meaningful exchange, and you can, and I've tried a number of times, as many of you will attest. You can describe it and you can talk about it infinitely. But it's only when you experience it that it all begins to make sense. So I want to thank Horst, first of all, for taking the time. We need to realize it's exactly from what, and this is one of the things that came up in the conversation, his time in Taiwan is exactly 12 hours from ours. So if it's 1 p.m. in the afternoon here in the Eastern Daylight Time Zone, it's 1 a.m. in Taiwan the next day. And so, we talked a little bit about that reality of the difference in time zones. But like me, if you turn on the television, it doesn't matter what network you watch. It doesn't take you long to realize that the world seems to be in turmoil. I would suggest to you there needs to be a lot more conversations across the span of continents than there has been up until this point. I would suggest to you that the technology that makes this possible holds for us tremendous potential for the future. I think we all have an obligation not only to embrace it, but to use it and hopefully, to a degree at least, master it. For our young people, there's absolutely no question that none of us are at the spot where we want to be, where we want to end up. What our young have to do is be able to pick up where we are and move the whole process forward. And I think that's an element of our education system that I think we have to spend a great deal more time emphasizing and stressing to our young people. You don't want to be satisfied, if I'm the instructor and you're the student, you don't want to be satisfied with knowing what I know. You should only be satisfied when you can take what I know and make it your own to the point that it enables you to move the process forward. If I could have done that, then I wouldn't be where I am. I'd be where I'd like to be. In reality, as an instructor in a classroom, I have to depend on you, the student, to take me there. I can't take you there, because if I could do that, I would be doing that. So my hope is that I can be somehow the spark that enables you to take where we are and move us all forward. It seems to me if we look at the educational experience from that perspective, we begin to draw some interesting conclusions and suppositions about what we're doing and why we need to do what we're doing better. Because it seems to me we tend to provide the check mark or give the A's to the people to the young people who are able to demonstrate that they know where we are, when in fact what we need to be doing is encouraging them to take the process forward. And I think that's really where all of us need to go. Again, I want to thank Horst. I know that was a long introduction to today's program, but I have to tell you that if you do have the time to go back and pick up that archive, either on YouTube.com or on whiterosesociety.org, you will thank us, all of us, for the opportunity, because I think it was a really good discussion. And it's not what I brought to the table, because I can't do that obviously by myself. And that's why I encourage you with phone numbers all the time to just basically let's get into exchange and see what happens. It's always positive. And the one thing I know going in is whoever is listening to this program, whoever listens to the Head On Radio Network, brings something rather special to the table to begin with. So I think all of us listening want to have the opportunity to hear what you've got to say. Again, the phone number 304-574-8178. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. I just want to basically mention this before we move on. I really want to spend the bulk of our program today looking at Hamilton's speech to the Constitutional Convention on the 18th of June, 1787. If you remember, on Wednesday's program, just at the point when Horst did call, we were at the point of getting into the speech. So it wasn't like we were, halfway through it and then stopped or anything like that. We really haven't taken it on yet. So that's really what I'd like to spend the bulk of our time on today. But before we get into that, I mentioned that I had gotten a few a few emails this weekend that I appreciated very much. And one of these is from Jack in Shreveport. And it was a link to an article in Salon, which turned out to be an excerpt from a book that is about to be published. I did some searching after I read the article, and the book is not going to be available, I believe, until September. The title of the book is called "The Lovers Quarrel: The Two Foundings and American Political Development." That's the title of the book. The author is a historian who teaches in Shanghai, as I believe, the National University in Shanghai. And I don't have his name right in front of me. His last name is Lim, L-I-M. The title of his book, you can look it up on Amazon if you'd like. The title of his book is The Lovers Quarrel, The Two Foundings in American Political Development. It is a book that is on the cusp of being published, but it hasn't been published as yet. This particular article, which I believe appeared in Salon, is an excerpt from that book. It's a fairly substantive excerpt. I've read it twice since Jack was kind enough to send it to me. And I just wanted to spend a few moments talking about it, because what really got Jack's attention, since Jack listens to the Virtual Center frequently, was his recognition that this book, at least the excerpt from this book, seems to touch on many of the same issues and areas that we've been dealing with here at the Virtual Center. And that's part of the reason why I want to share with you a few of the things that I picked up from this particular email. The idea of two foundings is really the major theme of this particular book, it appears. And what does that mean, two foundings? What it means is the Declaration of 1776 and the Constitution of 1787. And what this book seeks to do is explain the seeming confusion that exists between the two of those. The inclination that is so prevalent to see elements of the Declaration within the Constitution, to the point that frequently we are confronted with people in public life who mix the two up. Talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as being in the Constitution, for example. Or on the other way around, talk about the expression "we the people" as if it was in the Declaration of Independence. In other words, what we're dealing with, I think, is, and I would conclude, is a general public that is aware of a lot of the substance of both of these documents because we've studied them in school. Let's face it. We've, for years, these documents have been foisted upon us in one way or another, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully. And so we're very familiar with the contents, with some of the contents of both. But in terms of distinguishing between one and the other, which one belongs to the Declaration in 1776 and which particular item belongs to the Constitution of 1787, that usually requires a little bit more sophisticated knowledge and definition than most of us have. Consequently, there's a tendency to confuse them and to mix them up. What this book called The Lovers Quarrel is going to be about, is the extent to which, and this is what I wanted to share with you, and I just wanted you to think about it because I'm thinking about it as well. It appears that the main objective of this book is to suggest that today's political controversy with the Tea Party is but a rehash of the same controversy that went on at the time of the founding and has resurfaced periodically throughout American history. What I'm suggesting here is that the author of this book is clearly suggesting that today's Tea Party is the 18th century Anti-Federalist. And that what the Tea Party wants to do politically today, when they talk about taking back America, is to bring back the era of the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation. To bring back that point in American history when sovereignty resided in the states rather than in the federal government. And so today's Tea Party agenda is principally focused on reducing the power of the central government. That was the same agenda that the Anti-Federalists had in opposing the Constitution of the United States for ratification. The analogy first of all, it's an interesting one. There's absolutely no question that the more you think about that, the more you begin to realize that there's something to it. That there are so many similarities that one would be naive not to acknowledge that there does seem to be some connection. Let me conclude this with a couple of general conclusions that I've reached at this point. The first one is that I'm kind of debating with myself. This is a book that I need to read, since the theme is a theme that obviously is very, very real to me. Because I too have seen the similarities between the Anti-Federalists and some of the arguments and positions of our contemporaries in the Tea Party today. That's what this book is about, is the so-called two foundings. The implications that are, and at this point they're only implications because all I've been able to read is an excerpt from the final product. And I'm wrestling with myself about securing a copy of the final product when it's available. It's obviously a book I need to read. But already, even in the excerpt, I'm seeing a few things that give me pause. One of them is the thesis itself. I'm more than willing to concede that there are similarities between the Anti-Federalist arguments of the 1780s and some of the Tea Party positions in today's 21st century politics. The problem with a thesis in a book like this is that an author can get so caught up in the thesis that we begin to force fit the evidence into the thesis. Now, I don't have the book, so there's no way in the world I can know the degree to which this might be true. But already in the excerpts, I can see evidences of efforts to finally, to kind of force fit some of the issues into this formula that the author has insightfully created, because it is an insightful thesis. And while the author, at least in the portion that I've read so far, does not say this, I have begun to see it. I've begun to see one additional, what I think is very significant issue that this particular excerpt that I've read seems to touch on but doesn't really develop. I don't know if it'll be in the final product or not. And that is the assumption that the Anti-Federalist Tea Party position, which again, according to the thesis here, is connected, is linked, seems to be the product more of the uninformed than of the informed. In other words, there's kind of an overriding, underlying suggestion here that the Federalist position, the support for the Constitution and the validity of the Constitution, is the legitimate position. And the suggestion seems to hold that those who advocate that position tend to be the best informed, whereas those who continue to articulate the Anti-Federalist pro-1776 position are folks driven more by passion than by intellect. In the debates that we've been looking at recently in Gary Wills's book on the Declaration, we focused quite a bit on Jefferson's letters and consideration of the idea of the controversy between the heart and the head. There seems to be a suggestion in this particular piece that the Tea Party Anti-Federalist folks are governed more by the heart, whereas the Federalist pro-Constitution folks are driven by the head. In other words, by the reason and the logic and the intellectualism of the particular position in support of the strong federal government. But that's not really the most important part of this. Because if you take it to the next logical step, then what we're talking about is a difference of opinion that is driven principally by the economic and class divisions existent in our society. What do I mean here? And again, this is only a suggestion. I'm not criticizing the book for this because I don't know if it's in the final product or not. But there seems to be a suggestion here that those driven by the heart, those more governed or driven by emotion than by intellect, tend to be your poorer, less formally educated people, whereas those in the other camp tend to be your college-educated, more intellectual types. There are a couple, if that's true, if indeed that insight holds for the final product, then we are confronted with a few disturbing realities. Let me be blunt. One of the major concerns I have so far in the connection between the Tea Party and the Anti-Federalists is the fact that we know here at the Virtual Center, that there is intellectual substance, credibility, and integrity to much of the Anti-Federalist position. to assume that all the intellect and common sense is on one side, and that the other side is driven by emotion and passion and a lack of intellectual exercise and information, is blatantly wrong. And that's an issue that I have about the thesis so far. I believe, and I'm being blunt here, I believe to lump the Anti-Federalists in the same class with the Tea Party is to do a terrible disservice to the Anti-Federalist traditions in this nation. I don't believe that the most articulate spokesman for the Tea Parties today could carry the water for some of the leading Anti-Federalists. I have read a lot of the Anti-Federalist literature. I have immersed myself in the writings of Luther Martin of Maryland, who's one of the leading intellectual forces, I believe, in anti-federalism. Patrick Henry is the orator, but I would suggest the Luther Martins and Elbridge Gerrys of the world bear intellectual substance that would put to shame some of the most outspoken proponents of the Tea Party in today's America. There's no question that there's symmetry between the two positions. There's no question that there's substance and credibility to this thesis. But I think it has to be examined, and it has to be considered rather objectively. What my fear is that the apparent preference for the Federalist position that I'm seeing in the excerpts that I've read so far would at least in part help to explain efforts to link the Anti-Federalists of the 18th century with today's Tea Party, to the detriment of the Anti-Federalists, I believe. I guess what I'm saying is that there's much more to it than that. At the same time, I recognize that there is something to this particular position. So at this point, that's really all I wanted to say. I had marked a few places in the excerpts that I have, excuse me, where I thought I might share with you for an example of where this confusion comes from. A few of these things we've seen already. In the presidential campaign in 2011 of Herman Cain, many of you remember the Herman Cain candidacy, which existed in the spring of 2011 and flamed out pretty quickly. But when Herman Cain announced in May of 2011 that he was running for the Republican presidential nomination, in his announcement speech, he said the following, quote, "For the benefit for those that are not going to read it, the declaration, excuse me, a bit of a coughing spasm there. Herman Cain is talking about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Specifically, he's talking about the Constitution. And he says in his announcement speech in May 2011, for the benefit of those who are not going to read it because they don't want us to go by the Constitution, there's a little section in there that talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, unquote. And of course, we know that that little section about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is not in the Constitution at all. It's in the Declaration of Independence. So the next question is, how much can we make of that faux pas? Is Herman Cain confused? Is Herman Cain ignorant of what's where? Or is Herman Cain playing on the political realities of those who are inclined to take what they want to take from the Declaration and impose it upon the Constitution of the United States? In other words, is this an example of a mistake that Herman Cain made, or is this a shrewd part of a political agenda? Is he appealing to the uninformed by directing his campaign toward what they want to hear and what they believe, not what reality teaches us? At the Republican National Convention in 2012, one of the feature main addresses was delivered by Governor Mike Huckabee. Many of you have seen Mike Huckabee's television program on Fox News. And at the Republican National Convention in 2012, during his speech, which was given a lot of attention, a lot of traction at the time, because Huckabee was, for a time, was a candidate. In fact, his name is being thrown around again as a potential candidate in 2016. Huckabee talked about what the media refer to as the anti-federalization of federalism. In other words, mixing the two, the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists from the 18th century, by talking about the anti-federalization of federalism. And this is an excerpt from Mike Huckabee's address to the Republican National Convention in 2012. So fearful were they, the second founders, the proponents of the Constitution, so fearful were they that government would grow beyond their intention, that even after crafting our magnificent Constitution, they said, we can do even better. They added amendments that we call a Bill of Rights, that limit what the government can do and guarantee what we, the people, have the unimpeded right to do, whether to speak, assemble, worship, pray, publish, or even refuse intrusions into our homes. Unquote. What you see here is an example which Huckabee calls it anti-federalizing federalism. But what we see here is a classic example of merging the two positions, the first founding, the Declaration in 1776, with the second founding in 1787. And in looking at the Constitution, accepting and insisting upon the fact that it includes the relevant passages from the Declaration of Independence. More important, Huckabee's suggestion that advocates of the Constitution was so concerned about government power growing beyond their intention that even after they wrote the Constitution, they weren't satisfied until they added the Bill of Rights. Historically, we know that that is patently absurd. Without even getting into the specifics of the Bill of Rights, the idea that the Constitution of the United States was drafted and ratified through the efforts of people who were concerned about too much power and who were most concerned about finding ways to constrict and limit that power, that particular position is not historically valid at all. And then finally, this is just the third example, in 2012, at the National Convention of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, Newt Gingrich gave a speech. And in that speech, he said the following: "The right to bear arms comes from our Creator, not from our government. It is one of the inalienable rights alluded to in our Declaration of Independence." Unquote. That, we know, is totally inaccurate. Again, is Gingrich making a mistake? Is he uninformed? Or, because he's addressing the National Rifle Association, is he saying what his audience wants to hear, which is the right to bear arms is one of Jefferson's unalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence? What we're seeing is the extent to which spokesmen are more than willing to move back and forth between the two documents and to bring whatever fits the particular agenda at the time with them. In other words, they're more than willing to see whatever exists in the Constitution within the Declaration of Independence if it fits. In other words, they're taking things from the Declaration and calling them unalienable right, taking things from the Constitution, from the Bill of Rights, and assigning them to the status of unalienable rights in Jefferson's Declaration, or vice versa. There's absolutely no question that there's an issue here. I guess what I'm deciding is whether, in fact, I will expend the necessary dollars to pick up a copy of the Lovers Quarrel when the final product comes out. But again, I have to give the author credit because I think the issue that is raised here is a good one, is a meaningful one, is one that needs to be examined. I just worry a little bit about the efforts to force feed the evidence into a formula of explanation that might end up being overbearing. But we don't know that. So I wanted to share that with you because it touches so closely on many of the things that we've been talking about here at the Virtual Center. In our last program, before we were honored with a call from Taiwan, we were on the verge of looking at Alexander Hamilton's speech to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And I can remember that one of the things that I did was pick up Richard Beeman's book called Plain Honest Men, which is a chapter-by-chapter treatment of the Congress, the Constitutional Convention, almost on a day-by-day basis. And read you Beeman's conclusion about congressional reaction to Hamilton's speech. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I think what Beeman has been able to do by looking at Madison's notes, the evidence, the only documentation we have about Hamilton, we don't have a copy of his speech. All we have is what Madison said he spoke about. But what Beeman seems to have been able to do is talking about the congressional reaction to that speech, is to indicate how moved members of the convention were. When Hamilton finished and sat down, there was not applause, there were not questions. The Congress merely adjourned in silence. And what that indicates to Beeman, and what it indicates to me, is that what Hamilton was saying to that convention was incredible. I'm not saying that the members of the convention didn't agree with Hamilton, but neither am I saying that members of the convention agreed with them either. I think what Hamilton ended up doing in this speech was saying things that members of the convention really never believed they would hear. And of course, the irony is, if you go back to the beginning of the convention, when they made the decision to meet in secret and to not make the notes or the minutes of the convention or anything else available to the public outside, in theory at least, the purpose of the secrecy was so congressmen would feel comfortable saying what they really thought. What I'm picking up here is on the 18th of June, which is almost a month after the convention started. Actually, it is a month after the convention started. It's about 2.5 weeks after a quorum was achieved. Hamilton was the first one, up to this point at least, to shock the convention by saying what he really thought. And one of the things we're going to see in this speech is Hamilton almost apologizes for this. I mean, I made a point a few moments ago and said, when I was talking about the Tea Party, and said, I want to be blunt here. I wasn't nearly as blunt as Hamilton was during the convention on the 18th of June in 1787. But Hamilton opens the speech by telling the delegates assembled, I'm going to say what I think here. And the fact that there was no reaction to it could indicate that most of the members of the convention were stunned, that they totally disbelieved or disapproved what he said. Seems to me if they would have totally approved it, there would have been some indication of that. But the irony is, if they had totally disapproved it, there would have been indication of that as well. But the fact of the matter is, the reason that I want to spend time in addressing this speech is because we're at the beginning of taking on Gary Wills's book, Explaining America, and his treatment of the Federalist Papers. The first third of his book, we went through the organization of the book last week. The first third of the book is on the extent to which Madison, in several places throughout the Federalist Papers, is in sync with Hamilton, at least the stereotype of Hamilton. And likewise, there are places where Hamilton is much more Madisonian than most people have ever given him credit for. So I think the extent to which we see the same things in both of these authors of the Federalist Papers is worth some attention. There's no question that the stereotype of Alexander Hamilton is based principally on the substance of this speech. It is because of this speech that Hamilton has gone down in history ever since as an advocate of a super-strong central government, because in this speech, that's exactly what he advocates. So when we come back after a short break, we've just gone beyond the top of our first hour. When we come back after a break, we'll take on Alexander Hamilton's speech delivered to the Constitutional Convention on the 18th of June, 1787. If you would like, during our break, to go to the internet and look it up, just look up Madison's notes on the Federal Convention, and then go to June 18th. The entire day is devoted to Hamilton's speech. And that's what we will have when we come back from our break. Thank you for joining us today at the Virtual Center. Please stay with us. This is Bill O'Brien. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Thank you once again for that absolutely wonderful music. It was just great. I really enjoyed it. I almost hate to come back, actually, because I'd just rather sit here and listen to some of that music. You're picking great stuff. Thank you all. If you're just tuning in to the Virtual Center, I want to thank you for joining us. If you've been with us since the beginning of our program, 1 hour ago, then I want to thank you especially for staying with us. That says quite a lot, and I really want you to know that I appreciate it. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. If you are just joining us, we kind of laid the background for the speech delivered to the Constitutional Convention on the 18th of June, 1787, by Alexander Hamilton, and that's going to be the focus of the bulk of our second hour, and probably a little bit into tomorrow as well. I really don't think, I mean, if we sat here, we have to remember that Hamilton's speech consumed the full day of June 18th at the convention. So Madison calls it a 4 to 5 hour speech. Other people make reference to it as a 6-hour speech. But it was really all the convention was able to do that day, at least according to James Madison's notes. So as we get into this, I'd like to, I'm going to take the liberty of elaborating on some of these things in order to make what I can to fill in some of the historical blanks by explaining some of the references that Hamilton is making in this speech. I don't claim to be able to provide all of them, but I'll do the best I can. The only thing I have to say going in is that all of this is written by James Madison. This is James Madison's account of Hamilton's speech. So everything that we hear in your mind needs to be prefaced by Madison wrote and then whatever he wrote. So when I begin, for example, with the following: on motion of Mr. Dickinson to postpone the first resolution in Mr. Patterson's plan in order to take up the following, quote, that the Articles of Confederation ought to be revised and amended so as to render the government of the United States adequate to the exigencies, the preservation and the prosperity of the Union. The postponement was agreed to by 10 states. Pennsylvania divided. Couple of things to mention here. By Mr. Dickinson, we're talking about John Dickinson. And Mr. Patterson's plan is the so-called New Jersey plan, the small state plan. So where we are in the convention then, as of June 18th, is that the first plan introduced for the convention's consideration is the Virginia plan. That was introduced by Governor Randolph. It was Madison's plan. That's what our textbooks call the large state plan, because Madison would have provided the large states the bulk of the voting power under the Constitution as he proposed it, because he was going to make representation totally dependent on population. So that means that the states with the most people would have the greatest number of representatives. And at this point, we weren't talking about separating a Senate from a House. In fact, that proposal is the compromise that brings the two plans together and allows the convention to continue. But the whole idea here is the quote. The whole idea was that the Articles of Convention ought to be revised and amended so as to render the government adequate to the exigencies, the preservation, and the prosperity of the Union. And so consideration of the first resolution in Patterson's small state plan, which is the counter to the Virginia plan, is postponed so that Hamilton can speak. And Madison tells us the postponement was agreed to by 10 states. Pennsylvania divided. And then Madison begins to tell us about Hamilton's speech. And a couple of the interesting introductory comments that he makes I think are really relevant. Mr. Hamilton, he says, had hitherto been silent on the business before the convention. Up to this point, Hamilton had said almost nothing. Partly from respect to others whose superior abilities, age, and experience rendered him unwilling to bring forward ideas dissimilar to theirs, and partly from his delicate situation with respect to his own state, to whose sentiments, as expressed by his colleagues, he could by no means accede. Period. What Madison is saying is, up to this point in the convention, Hamilton was silent. And the two reasons for his silence were, first, that he was unwilling to bring up ideas that the delegates disagreed with, especially because so many of the delegates were older and more experienced and more acknowledged for their reputations than he was. In other words, what Madison is saying is, one reason he didn't say anything up to this point is because he was intimidated by the audience. And the second reason that he didn't say a whole lot up to this point is because Hamilton was in the minority in his own delegation. There were 3 representatives at the convention from New York: Hamilton, Yates, and Lansing. Yates and Lansing were both Anti-Federalists. Each state had 1 vote. So effectively, that meant that Hamilton's voice was not going to be heard in anything that they voted for, because New York would always vote opposite to the way that Hamilton would vote. So up to this point, the reality that he was a minority in his own delegation kept Hamilton silent until this day. And then Madison goes on. The crisis, however, which now marked our affairs, was too serious to permit any scruples whatever to prevail over the duty imposed on every man to contribute his efforts for the public safety and happiness. In other words, the convention had reached a point of crisis. No longer could anyone afford to remain silent. And of course, the crisis is we have these 2 competing plans on the table now that Patterson has introduced the small state plan. He, meaning Hamilton, he was obliged, therefore, to declare himself unfriendly to both plans. So this is the first piece of substantive evidence we've got as to where Hamilton stood on the issues before the convention up to that point. Basically, what Madison tells us at the very beginning is that Hamilton opened up by saying that he was opposed to both plans. And then Madison goes on. He was particularly opposed to that from New Jersey, the small state plan, being fully convinced that no amendment of the Confederation leaving the states in possession of their sovereignty could possibly answer the purpose. So what Madison has told us is, A, Hamilton really was opposed to both plans, but B, he was more opposed to the small state plan than the other. Principally because, for those of you who remember your history, principally because the small state plan, the so-called New Jersey plan, was designed to really revise the Articles by keeping the states sovereign. And of course, given New Jersey's status as a small state, then by leaving the Articles of Confederation the way it was, where each state was independent, each state had 1 vote, then that meant that New Jersey's vote was as powerful as was Virginia's. Under the Virginia plan, that no longer would have held. So what Madison is telling us is that in his particular opposition to the New Jersey plan, Hamilton is basically saying that any plan, the New Jersey plan, which seeks to keep the states in possession of their sovereignty, as does the New Jersey plan, can't possibly be the plan we're looking for, can't possibly solve the problems that we've got. On the other hand, Madison says, Hamilton, he confessed, he was much more discouraged by the amazing extent of country in expecting the desired blessings from any general sovereignty that could be substituted. In other words, while he was so opposed to the New Jersey plan, he still had serious questions about the other plan, principally because of the extent of country with one general sovereignty. In other words, a national government. So he had questions about that, whether one government could make decisions for such a vast and diverse nation. And then Madison goes on, and he's basically, this is all in Hamilton's speech. As to the powers of the convention, he thought the doubts started on that subject had arisen from distinctions and reasonings too subtle. In other words, what Hamilton is saying is, as far as the convention is concerned, he thinks that we're nitpicking. We're raising questions about whether we have the authority to do this or whether we have the authority to do that. And Hamilton's point is, if we get too hung up on these many issues, we'll not really get to the issues that we need to address. So he was kind of chastising the convention for getting hung up on details. And then he goes on. A federal government he conceived to mean an association of independent communities into one. Different confederacies have different powers and exercise them in different ways. In some instances, the powers are exercised over collective bodies, in others over individuals, as in the German Diet and among ourselves in cases of piracy. In other words, what he's saying is that a federal government can be, can be structured in a number of different ways. It's made up of a variety, an association of independent communities into one overall community. That's what a federal government does. But then he says different confederacies have different strategies or different ways of handling these things. And he uses the German Diet as an example. Great latitude, therefore, must be given to the signification of the term. In other words, we've got to be flexible here, is what he's saying. The plan last proposed, the New Jersey plan, the small state plan, departs itself from the federal idea as understood by some, since it is to operate eventually on individuals. In other words, what Patterson has done in his plan, which would keep the Articles of Confederation basically intact, is he's changed the whole name of the game that we were talking about when we were talking about the Virginia plan. Because his plan suggests that we would not continue to pursue the so-called federal idea of one government for everybody, but rather his plan would focus primarily on individuals themselves within the states. He agreed, moreover, with the honorable gentleman from Virginia, Mr. R., that's Randolph, Edmund Randolph, that we owed it to our country to do on this emergency whatever we should deem essential to its happiness. In other words, in spite of the fact that the two plans, the small state, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan was so different, Hamilton is saying one thing that Randolph had going for is that we owe it to the country to do whatever we have to do to make this work. And Hamilton is saying, on that I agree with him. The states sent us here to provide for the exigencies of the Union, to rely on and propose any plan not adequate to these exigencies merely because it was not clearly within our powers would be to sacrifice the means to the end. And this is a key sentence. Hamilton says the states sent us here to do a job. namely to do whatever we had to do in order to support the Union, the exigencies of the Union. To rely on any plan which doesn't do that, Hamilton says, merely because it's not spelled out in our instructions, would be to sacrifice the means to the end. In other words, we would be constraining ourselves because of the rules to the point that we wouldn't be able to do what we were sent here to do. We wouldn't be able to accomplish our purpose because we get hung up on the technicalities. What Hamilton is arguing for here is a very general look at instructions. He's encouraging the delegates at the convention to think big and don't allow yourself to be hamstrung by the rules that the people gave you when they sent us here. In other words, what Hamilton's saying is, they sent us here to do a job, damn it, let's do it, is what he's saying. And let's not get tied up, because when they wrote the rules for us, they didn't really understand the full meaning, the full ramifications of what they were asking us to do. We've got a job to do, let's do it. He says, it may be said that the states cannot ratify a plan not within the purview of the Articles of Confederation providing for alterations and amendments. Now Hamilton is acknowledging the Articles of Confederation. According to the Articles of Confederation, any alteration or any amendment to the Articles required the approval of all 13 states. So what Hamilton is saying here is, it may be that some people are hung up on that because they're figuring whatever we do, all the states are going to have to agree on it anyway. But then Hamilton says, but may not the states themselves, in which no constitutional authority equal to this purpose exists in the legislatures, have had in view a reference to the people at large? In other words, Hamilton is saying to the convention, let's not get tied up in the small stuff. Let's not let the Articles of Confederation and what it requires keep us from doing our jobs. And then he gives an example of what he's talking about. And Hamilton says, in the Senate of New York, a proviso was moved that no act of the convention should be binding until it should be referred to the people and ratified. And the motion was lost by a single vote only. The reason assigned against it being that it might possibly be found an inconvenient shackle. What Hamilton is saying, this is the end of a paragraph here. What Hamilton is basically saying is, let's not allow ourselves to tie each other up in knots over the rules. We were sent here to do a job, that namely, whatever we needed to do in order to provide for the exigencies of the Union. It doesn't matter what our instructions were. It doesn't matter what the specifics of the charge that the people gave us when they sent us here were. It doesn't matter what the Articles of Confederation required. This is a new ball game, and we got to play it. So what Hamilton does in his speech, first is lay out the monumental nature of the challenge that they have. And what Madison is saying, and keep in mind, Madison is going to be the co-author with Hamilton of the Federalist Papers, and once the ratification thing gets to New York. So in spite of the fact that they have differences, Hamilton and Madison are on the same team here. So consequently, Madison's treatment of Hamilton in the notes, one can expect, is probably at least friendly. And what Madison says here is that Hamilton got up before the convention, admitted that he hadn't said anything until now because he didn't feel qualified to say anything in an audience so prestigious, plus the fact that he was a minority in his own delegation. But the fact of the matter is we were sent here to do a huge job. That is, to correct the problems in the nation. We were all given instructions. Some of us feel that those instructions limit what we can do. The Articles of Confederation said that any proposed amendments or changes in the Articles need to be approved by all the states. We can't let those details keep us from doing what we were sent here to do. So let's do it. And then he gives an example of in New York, where an effort that nothing in the convention could be approved until it was referred back to the people and approved by them. That motion in the New York Senate lost by only one vote. In other words, only by one vote did we agree to come here and do what we need to do and not allow ourselves to be shackled by our own rules and provisions. So now Hamilton cranks up and gets into the substance of his speech. The great question, he says, is what provision shall we make for the happiness of this country? What is it we need to do? What are we about? He would first, remember, it's Madison speaking in his notes, he would first make a comparative examination of the two plans. In other words, what Hamilton is doing is laying out where he wants to go in his speech. This is what I'm going to do, is what he's saying. Here's my plan. First, he said, we need to make a comparative examination of the two plans. Prove that there are essential defects in both, and point out such changes as might render a national one efficacious. So Madison tells us that Hamilton's strategy was to say to the convention, here's what I propose to do today. This is what I'm going to talk to you about. The first thing I'm going to do is a comparing of the two plans, and thereby prove that there are defects in both of them. And then what I'm going to do is suggest what has to be done in order to make this sucker work. And Hamilton goes on. The great and essential principles necessary for the support of government are. Now Hamilton is going to lay out, this is what we've got to do. The essential principles necessary for the support of government, what we have to do is the following. Number one, and it's in his notes, number one, an active and constant interest in supporting it. The first principle necessary to make sure that government will work, that what we do here works, is an active and constant interest in supporting it. We've got to find a way to make sure that the people have reason to support what we're doing, to support the plan. We've got to take into consideration or recognize that a first principle is that there must be an active, constant mechanism whereby the people continue to support it. Government will not work without the support of its people. And now Hamilton is going to go on and clarify this particular issue of an active and constant support for government. This principle, he says, does not exist in the states in favor of the federal government. In other words, already we got a problem. because the support of what we do does not exist in the states in favor of a federal government. They have evidently, in a high degree, the esprit de corps. They constantly pursue internal interests adverse to those of the whole. They have their particular debts, their particular plans of finance, etc. All these, when opposed to, invariably prevail over the requisitions and plans of Congress. So in other words, the first thing that has to happen is that there has to be an active, constant support for what we do here. And the fact of the matter is, in many of the states currently, that support is not there. For the most part, they're hung up on their own internal interests within their own states. They've got their own debt issues, their own finance issues. They're not willing to suspend these in the interests of the benefits of everybody in the country. So that's the first principle necessary, is to find a way to build that support. Number two, the love of power. This is the second principle necessary to the support of government. The love of power. Hamilton says, men love power. The same remarks are applicable to this principle. The states have constantly shown a disposition rather to regain the powers delegated by them than to part with more, or to give effect to what they had parted with. The ambition of their demagogues is known to hate the control of the general government. It may be remarked, too, that the citizens have not that anxiety to prevent a dissolution of the general government as of the particular governments. A dissolution of the latter would be fatal. Of the former would still leave the purposes of government attainable to a considerable degree. Consider what such a state as Virginia will be in a few years. A few compared with the life of nations. How strongly will it feel its importance and self-sufficiency? Men love power, Hamilton says. Consequently, the same thing we said about building the support in number one apply to this principle. The states have constantly shown a disposition to hold on to their own power and not to give it up to a general government. He said they hate the ambition of their delegates within the demagogues within the states is known to hate the control of the general government. In other words, these demagogues, their power is based on the power of the state that they're in. They hate the idea of a general government because it's going to cost them power. Citizens also are hung up on this idea. They don't like the idea of general government either because it's too distant, it's too far away, it's too abstract. Consequently, he's talking about the state of Virginia as an example. Virginia is the biggest, most powerful state in the Union. Think about how it feels, where it's going to be in a couple of years if we get a national government. It's got more to lose than anybody because since it's the biggest state, it packs the most power, the most influence. If we create a general government, it's going to lose that influence. So what Hamilton is saying then is what we're proposing here, which is a general government necessary to the exigencies of the Union flies in the face of the priorities of what we've got now. We don't have the support for it, the constant support of the people. We don't have the support of states. The states are very selfish about giving up their own power because currently they've got it all. Why in heaven's name would they give it up? The third principle necessary, he says, is an habitual attachment to the people. The whole force of this tie, Hamilton says, is on the side of the state government. Its sovereignty is immediately before the eyes of the people. Its protection is immediately enjoyed by them. From its hand distributive justice, and all those acts which familiarize and endear government to a people, are dispensed to them. The habitual attachment of the people we don't have. The whole force of that attachment of citizens now is to the state governments. That's the government they see. That's the government they know. That's the one that's close. It's right before their eyes. That's the one they look to for protection of its rights, for the distribution of justice. Everything they know about government at this point comes from the state government. This is one of the things we're going to have to consider. The fourth consideration, the fourth principle we need to deal with, force by which may be understood a coercion of laws or coercion of arms. We are going to have to seriously consider in the government we create the issue of force, power, coercion. In a very famous letter prior to the Constitutional Convention, George Washington talked about the fact that what this nation needs is a government with the power to coerce. Government has to have the power to enforce its own laws, its own will. Otherwise, it's a paper tiger. So here, now Hamilton is addressing that by saying, force by which may be understood a coercion of laws or coercion of arms. Congress have not the former except in a few cases. In other words, you remember, under the Articles of Confederation, Congress didn't have the power to force anybody to do anything. All it could do was request. In particular states, this coercion is nearly sufficient, though he held it in most cases not entirely so. Again, it's Madison talking. In particular states, this coercion, Hamilton said, is nearly efficient, though he held that in most cases not enough, not entirely so. A certain portion of military force is absolutely necessary in large communities. Massachusetts is now feeling this necessity and making provision for it. Massachusetts in 1786 had experienced Shays' Rebellion. So what Hamilton is saying, Massachusetts knows now, finally, that government has to have the power to enforce its own rules. But how can this force be exerted on the states collectively? It is impossible, Hamilton says. It amounts to a war between the parties. Foreign powers also will not be idle spectators. They will interpose, the confusion will increase, and a dissolution of the Union ensue. So what Hamilton is basically saying here is that in order to provide for the exigencies of the Union, we are going to have to create a government that has the power to coerce, the power to force people to obey its laws, its rules. So we've got, going back and summarizing all of them, we've got to have a government that somehow can elicit the support and the constant active support of its people. Right now, only the states have that. The second thing is we've got to have a government that can win over from the states this interest of citizens in people so that citizens will support the new government and not just their state governments. The third thing we've got to address is the fact that men love power. Power-hungry men within the states have power, but only so long as the states remain sovereign. So within every state, there's going to be people who are opposed to a general government. We've got to deal with that. Third, we've got to find a way to win the habitual attachment of the people from their states to this new government. And that takes us to number 5, influence, Hamilton says. He did not mean corruption, but a dispensation of those regular honors and emoluments which produce an attachment to the government. What has to happen, Hamilton is saying, is the government we create must have influence. It must be a government that draws support, a government that people look to and respect, that exudes influence. Now, after those 5 points about what our challenge is, Hamilton goes back to the general situation at hand by saying, almost all the weight of these is on the side of the state. If you look at all 5 of these that are necessary to effective government, currently all 5 of them belong to the states, Hamilton is saying. And must continue so long as the states continue to exist. I need to pause here. Think of the implications of this statement to the audience of delegates sent there with instructions to represent their states. Hamilton is saying almost all the weight of these principles that we've just addressed is on the side of the states, and it must continue so long as the states continue to exist. What Hamilton is suggesting here is maybe the only way that we can shift people's loyalty from their states to the central government is to abolish the states. Can you imagine the reaction in that convention hall? There's no way, Hamilton is saying, that we can address the problem as long as the states continue to exist. As long as they continue to exist, he's saying, they will have the very things that the government we create needs. Hamilton goes on. All the passion then we see of avarice, ambition, and interest, which govern most individuals and all public bodies, fall into the current of the states and do not flow in the stream of the general government. So Hamilton is laying out the immensity of the challenge that this convention faces. All the passions of avarice, ambition, interest, which govern most individuals and all public bodies, will generally be an overmatch for the general government. They currently fall in the direction of the states. They do not flow in the stream of the general government. The former, therefore, the state governments, the former, therefore, will generally be an overmatch for the general government and render any confederacy in its very nature precarious. Theory is in this case fully confirmed by experience. As long as the states continue to exist, and as long as they remain sovereign, as they have the bulk of the power, and as long as people are inclined to look to their state governments, for justice, for protection, for safety, for happiness, as long as the current situation continues to exist, our challenge is one we can't successfully meet. And then he says, theory in this case is fully confirmed by experience. Theory tells us that as long as people's total focus is on the states, we don't have a chance. Experience tells us, our own experience under the Articles tells us, that this is exactly what we're facing. And then Hamilton goes through a series of examples of other confederacies throughout the world. What he has basically done here is lead the convention to the point of suggesting that as long as we insist on a confederacy of independent states rather than a government over the states, we can't solve these problems. We're wasting our time. And as I mentioned, he goes through a number of examples. He talks about Philip. He talks about the Amphictyonic Council. He talks about the German Confederacy, if was another lesson. The authority of Charlemagne seemed to be as great as could be necessary. The great feudal chiefs, however, exercising their local sovereignties, soon felt the spirit and found the means of encroachments which reduced the imperial authority to a nominal sovereignty. So in other words, he's going through all throughout history, all these examples. No matter what the challenge was, as long as you preserved a confederacy, everything failed. All possible solutions failed. Other examples, Hamilton says, instruct us in the same truths. The Swiss cantons have scarce any union at all and have been more than once at war with one another. So now Hamilton is drawn to a conclusion. This I've highlighted in my hard copy of the speech. How then are all these evils to be avoided? Only by such a complete sovereignty in the general government as will turn all the strong principles and passions above mentioned to one side, on its side. What Hamilton is saying is, as long as we try to preserve a confederacy, our problems remain unsolvable. How then are all of these evils to be avoided, Hamilton asks? Only by such a complete sovereignty in the general government as will turn all the strong principles and passions above mentioned on its side. What Hamilton is proposing is that what we've got to do is create a government over everybody that has complete sovereignty to the point that all of these other things become solvable, become meaningless. How does the scheme of New Jersey produce this effect? Does it afford any substantial remedy whatever? On the contrary, Hamilton says, it labors under great defects, and the defects of some of its provisions will destroy the efficacy of others. Basically, what Hamilton has done in his speech is make the case that the New Jersey plan can't work because the New Jersey plan is based on the sovereignty of the states, on the equality of the states and the power of the states. And even though the New Jersey plan incorporates reforms and changes in the Confederation, the mere fact that it preserves the structure of a confederacy dooms the plan from the very beginning. What Hamilton is basically saying is anything that preserves confederacy, anything other than a government over all the states with complete sovereignty, complete power over them, can't work. I guess what we have to say, we've only got about 2 or 3 minutes left in our program today. What we basically have to conclude here is that Hamilton has shocked this convention into dead silence. What Hamilton has done up to this point in his speech is he's encouraged the delegates to not feel confined by the instructions that the people in their states gave it. What he's done, in effect, is encourage people to say, put the needs that brought us here above the rules we were given to function by. Focus on the ends, not the means. In other words, what he's saying is be flexible. Then what he's done is he's gone through 5 of the key ingredients necessary for government to be effective. And what he's basically done is say, in the current situation we find ourselves, all 5 of these pertain to the states, not to the central government, not to the general government. Consequently, what Hamilton says is the basic structure of government that we have currently under the Articles of Confederation, which is a confederation, cannot work. He goes specifically to the New Jersey plan and points out its structure and says it can't work. The only thing that will work, Hamilton has said, is complete sovereignty in a general government, which means power has to be removed from the states and shifted to the central government. That's the only way that these evils, he said, can be avoided. And by doing that, all the concerns that we've just addressed would be turned on its side, so to speak. Hamilton proposes revolution to the members of this convention. He's proposing that they scrap their instructions and they begin to do things they were not authorized to do by the people who sent them there. Now what Hamilton is going to set out to do is address the Virginia plan, which is the plan for a strong central government. We're 1 minute from the end of our program, and we need to leave in order to give our 3 o'clock program time to get started. Let me invite you to be back with us tomorrow. Reminder that tomorrow's program will begin 30 minutes later, 1:30 in the East. It'll be our Tuesday program. It will only extend for 90 minutes rather than the full 120 minutes. For the Virtual Center, for Bob Kincaid and his folks at the Head On Radio Network, I'm Bill O'Brien. Thank you for tuning in today, and we invite you to come back tomorrow to another session at the Virtual Center. Thank you.